Hello, and welcome, boys and girls, to the channel Xcode Bill. I'm your host, Bill Yengo. It's a very beautiful morning here in the Republic of Cameroon, West Africa. In this video tutorial, however, we will try to understand what callback functions are in JavaScript. We'll look at why they matter and how to use them effectively. Now, what is a callback function, you might ask? Simply put, a callback function is a function that is passed as an argument to another function. In this case, the receiving function decides why, how, and when to execute the callback function. So when do we use callback functions? We mostly use them when we want to work with asynchronous executions. You want to do non-blocking queries, you want to make API calls, and they are used extensively when you want to do things like event handling, be it button clicks or working with HTML inputs. They're also used in functional programming extensively. Without much chit chat, let's hop in and let's get cracking. Currently, I do have a folder called Callback, and inside that, we're going to do a code dot, which basically will run our folder in VS Code. Now, before we get into playing around with callback functions, you have to ensure that you have Node installed by doing node-v. You also have to ensure that you have nodemon installed. It's installed globally, and we'll use that to ensure that we can run our file, and then once we make changes, those changes are being reflected. So let's go ahead and do a nodemon, and we'll do example one, which basically will run this folder. Now, let's look at a basic callback function. Let's create a function called greet, and this is very basic. And it's going to take in a name, and it's also going to take a callback function. And all we want to do is we want to do a console log and say hello, whatever that name value is. And then at the end, we just want to do a callback, which means we want to call our function. So in order to use this, we come down to the bottom and we say greet, and then we pass in a name variable, and let's just say Bill. And we then do an anonymous function, which is an arrow function, and we say a console log, and we say goodbye, for instance. So let's save that. And you notice that we have hello Bill and goodbye Bill. So what that basically does is that it calls this line of code and then calls the callback function. Now this callback function can also be passed in a value depending on what that value is. And then we come in here as well, we pass in the name value, right? And then we want to then say goodbye, and then we want to provide the name, okay? So once we do that, we notice that we have hello Bill and goodbye Bill. Now this might look a little bit confusing, but my advice is that when you're working with callback functions, make sure that you always create a different function that you can call as the callback function. So we're going to say create a function called, let's put a capital B, and then it's going to take in a name value, and all we want to do is we want to run this line of code in here. So we'll do a console log goodbye name. And in order to call the function properly now, there are two ways you can do that. You can you can call the greet function, then you get the name value, and then you pass in that name value to goodbye. But a more professional way of doing it is that you get rid of this, and then goodbye will basically receive that value being passed in. So this is called in this particular manner, and what it does is it does the same thing, which is called the console log, and then takes in or calls the callback function and takes in the name as as an input. So another way that callback functions are used is setTimeout. So we're going to go ahead and do a nodemon example2.js. By default, we expect JavaScript to run every single line of code. It basically says console log start and end. But now we're going to do a setTimeout, right? And a setTimeout takes a callback function, and we say that we want to call this function after 2000 milliseconds, which is approximately 2 seconds. And all we want to do is do a console log, and then we'll simulate that term that fetched, right? So what you notice is that instead of running this code one line after the other, it runs this code, it comes here and says, oh, I have scheduled this particular function in here, this callback function, to be run after 2 seconds. So it comes to the end, and then once 2 seconds is elapsed, it comes back to this line and runs this line of code. Now let's simulate a data fetch, data being fetched, right? So let's say let that turn, and then we're not going to initialize it. And we're going to come in here and set that data to say Bill. And then we'll come here and we'll say if data, then we want to do a console log of data. So if you notice, it's going to come to this line. It'll come here, data is not yet initialized. It will skip this line because we've set this to run after 2 seconds. It's going to come and check for the value of data, and it does not exist. So it will not run this line of code. It will then come here, run this line of code, and once 2 seconds has elapsed, it's going to come back and then log this, right? Now, in order to test a different variable of this, we're going to comment this out, and then we're going to initialize data to be, say, Bill. And then what you notice is that it's going to run this. It will come here, the value of data is initialized. It's going to come here and check for the value of data, and it's going to print it out here. It will come and run this line of code here. And then once 2 seconds has elapsed, it will come back here and it's going to log this. Now, this is just a sample in order to help us visualize fetching data. So callback functions are very essential when you're working with web documents and all that. And something that I failed to mention was that you have to ensure that you have a package installed globally. You can also install that as an extension on VS Code, which is called Live Server. I have that installed globally, so we're going to do a live server dot, and this will basically run this particular folder here, and it's going to load the index.html as the home, right? So we have a little button here. We're going to take inspect, and we're going to go to console log. So what that basically does is that it loads our HTML page. We have a boilerplate, we have a body, then we have a button here, and then we are injecting this particular script, which is an example 3.js. And if we come here, we can start to work with that. Now, if you click the click me button, nothing happens. So we want to handle that particular event where the user decides to click the button, right? So we then say const button is equals to document.get element by ID. And then remember that if you look at this HTML file here, we passed it an ID of btn. So we want to say get element by ID btn. And then we want to say button.add event listener. And on the bottom, we have multiple events like abort, we have blur, but we're interested in the click event. And then we're going to pass in an underscore for now, which is basically going to act as a placeholder for our event handler. And then we now say function, and we say handle button click, and it's basically going to take by default an event. And all we want to do for the moment is just log the event. And then we also want to log, say, clicked, or we can say button clicked, right? And then we're going to pass this callback function here. So when the button is clicked, it should call this function and then pass in the event variable. And if we come here and we do click, we notice that we're logging the event, and we're also logging the button click. Now, just for fun, you might want to pass in some extra data to that event handler besides the event. What you can do is you can come here and then you can say, I want to bind, right? And if you have a different object, you can bind that to this particular handle button click, but we want to bind it to itself. And then we want to pass in some data. It could be anything. For now, we'll just pass in the name Bill. And then we come to our event handler function, and then we'll just say that we're passing the data, and then the second value that we're going to pass, which is passed by default, is the event. So we come in here and we'll do CLG, which is a console log, and we say we want to log the data. Let's go ahead and click on the click name, and we notice that we are logging the event here, and then we're logging the data that we passed in, which was Bill, and then we're logging the button clicked as well. So in our initial definition of callback functions, we said the function that calls it basically determines why, if, and when the callback function is being called. So let's simulate data being fetched. So we're going to create a function called fetch data, which is going to receive a callback function. And then at the bottom, we'll just say if not data. We want it to do a log and say requesting data. And then at the bottom, let's create a callback function and call that process data. And inside, it's going to receive the data as well, which is a call because it's a callback function. And then we're just going to log processing data. And then at the bottom, we will do a console log of data, right? So we have this and we notice that nothing happens. That's because our data is not initialized. It comes in here and checks the data is still not initialized. And so it does nothing. And then it doesn't call the process or the callback function because we're not calling that. And then we're going to go ahead and call a function called fetch data and pass in the callback function of process data. So what you notice is that it's going to come into the fetch data. It will check no data is available. So it's going to say requested data, and that's it. So we're going to go ahead and have two setTimeout functions. And the first one will receive a callback that will be called after a period of 1000 milliseconds. Second callback function will be called after 500 milliseconds. Now in here, and the second timeout, which is going to be called before the other one, we'll do a console log and we will say fetching data. Then it's in here that we're actually going to define that data. For now, we're not going to do that. So we want to simulate the data fetch. So inside here, we're going to say if data, we want to do a callback and we want to pass in the value of data. Let's spread this out a little bit. And what we notice is that we come in here to fetch data. We come in here, it comes down to this line of code and the data is not yet available. It then says requesting data and then the data is not being set, right? Now, what we're going to do now is that in this particular case, now we want to define what data is. So we say data is equals to an object and then we say name of Bill Yengo. So if you notice, there's a change now, right? Because what happens is that we call a fetch data function. It comes in here, it receives a callback function, which is process data. It comes to the bottom of our code because these ones are defined to run after a given amount of time. So what happens is that it checks data is not yet initialized. So what happens is that it logs fetching data. It logs this line of code here, what you see here. And then after a given period of time, the set timeout that is set to run after 500 milliseconds is run, and it now says, oh, fetching data. So this fetching data is now being logged, and then it now sets the data to this particular object. Now, once this is done, you notice that this function is now run after 1 second, which is after this set timeout function has been called, and then it now makes a check if the data is available. At this particular point, the data is available. It now makes a call to the callback function, which is our process data function that says, oh, now I have data. So it now logs the processing data and then logs the data. So this is just a quick and basic simulation of how we use callback function, or how callback functions are used under the hood, fetch data from a database or from a third-party API service. So one of the main issues or pitfalls with callback is what they call deeply nested callbacks, which results in code being hard to read. And then this is being fixed with things like promises, async await, which underneath use callback functions. So let's demonstrate how this can look weird or hard to read. In this code example, we have step 1, step 2, step 3. And each of this function calls callback after doing a console log of, say, step 1, 2, and 3. Now, a typical way that you will call this function is like this. Now, if you look at this, it looks a little bit weird. It looks a little bit, cumbersome. And if we log that, we notice that it goes through each one of those codes and logs out step 1, 2, and 3. So let's have a quick look on how this is fixed. We're not going to go deep into it. We'll use promises for that. And in the next video, we'll dive deep into promises and async await. So let's see how this is fixed, or this problem is fixed when it comes to promises. So promises are seen as a better way to write cleaner callback code because you can use things like .then and .catch. So let's go ahead and do a function fetch data, which is a function, and let's define a variable called data. We're not going to initialize at this particular point, and what we'll say is that we'll return a new promise, and a promise takes a resolve and a reject callback function, and we will spread this out, and then in here we will do a set timeout, right? That's because we just want to simulate data being fetched, and it takes another callback, and we want this to be called after 1000 milliseconds. And inside here, we're going to then initialize the data, and it's going to be name of Bill Yengo. So basically an object that has a name of Bill Yengo. And then we're going to write a ternary operation, and we're basically going to say if the data is available, we want to call the resolve with that data. But if it is not, we want to reject that, which basically means something went wrong. And we'll pass in the message something went wrong, right? So that should do the trick. But let's comment this out for the moment. And then we can come down here and we can say fetch data. And then you now have access to things like the .then, which is passed in the resolved data. And then we can say console log data. And if that failed, we can then do a catch, and then we pass in an error, which for the moment is the message that we sent back. And we'll do a console log of the error, right? Let's get rid of this. So if we save the code, we notice that it comes into our fetch data function. It sees that our data is not yet initialized. We do a check here and say if at this particular point the data is not initialized, so it calls the reject callback, which is then reflected in the catch block. Now, if we uncomment this, we notice that, and we save that, we notice that it then comes, it checks, and then it realizes that the data has been initialized. It calls the resolve callback function, which is basically passed into the then, and then it passes in the data that we provided, and then just does a console log of that. So this is a cleaner way to write callback functions. In the next video, we'll go in depth into promises and the async await. So this brings us to the end of this video tutorial. I am very, very grateful that you made it to the end. I hope you did enjoy the content. And if you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment in the comment section. Don't forget to hit the notification button as well to stay up to date with new content. Till next time, stay blessed and in good health.